dark waves crashing, low hum of wind, radio static fading in. It was December 1971. A ghostly silence hung over the Bay of Bengal, a silence that only comes before a storm. The waves rolled endlessly toward the coast of East Pakistan, carrying whispers of something that would change the subcontinent forever. On the horizon, the Pakistani Navy's ships moved like steel shadows, unaware that beneath the calm blue surface, a rebellion was rising, one that wouldn't come with grand speeches or tanks on streets, but through the silent choke of the sea. Heartbeat sounds. On one side stood the Pakistan Navy, proud, powerful, built to dominate the waters. On the other, hidden among fishermen and villages, were men who had nothing. No fleet, no formal training, no uniforms. They called themselves Mukti Bahini, the liberation force. To the world, they were guerrillas. To the people of Bengal, they were saviors. But before the world learned their name, before their daring sea raids and sabotage missions that strangled Pakistan's naval lifelines, there was humiliation, silence, and rage. Waves crashing harder. Rewind to March 1971, when language became a weapon, when identity became a battlefield. Pakistan was divided, not just by geography, but by heart. West Pakistan ruled with arrogance, while East Pakistan, culturally and linguistically Bengali, felt like a colony of its own country. Elections had promised change. The Awami League, led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, had won a sweeping victory, but West Pakistan's generals refused to hand over power. Gunfire echoes. Then came Operation Searchlight, a night soaked in blood. The Pakistan Army unleashed its fury upon Dhaka. University students were dragged from dormitories. Teachers, poets, artists, executed. Entire neighborhoods burned. The streets ran red with a single message: obedience or death. Silence. But death didn't bring silence. It brought fire. The survivors fled across the border into India, and there, in the refugee camps of Tripura, Assam, and West Bengal, vengeance began to take shape. In a cramped tent near Agartala, a young man stared at the map spread across the ground. His name was Commodore Mohammed Mozammel Haq, once a proud officer of the Pakistan Navy. He had seen too much: the discrimination, the neglect of Bengali sailors, the arrogance of Karachi's command. He knew that the war could not be won on land alone. To strangle Pakistan, one had to choke its supply lines, the arteries that fed its military might in the east. And so, a new idea was born. A navy that didn't exist would rise. A rebellion from the sea. Waves swelling. They called it Mukti Bahini's naval wing, but in truth it was nothing more than a dream and a handful of men with courage far greater than their weapons. With Indian support, they began training, not in grand naval academies, but in secret coastal bases along the Sundarbans and Andaman approaches. Fishermen became saboteurs, river pilots became smugglers of freedom, and the sea, once belonging to the Pakistani fleet, slowly turned hostile, explosion echoing faintly. Their first mission came on a night when the moon hid behind clouds. A small wooden boat loaded with explosives drifted silently toward the anchorage at Chittagong. On board were 3 men, young, trembling, but fearless. They were not soldiers. They were ordinary Bengalis, a dock worker, a fisherman, a student. As they neared a Pakistani patrol craft, one of them whispered, "For my motherland," and struck the detonator. The night sky erupted. Fire lit the waters like dawn. Chittagong trembled. And for the first time, Pakistan realized its own waters were no longer safe. But success brought consequences. Pakistan's naval command began hunting the Mukti Bahini. Villages suspected of sheltering them were burned. Fishermen were executed on suspicion alone. The sea itself became a graveyard of innocents. Yet for every man Pakistan killed, 10 more rose from the ashes. The Indian Navy began to notice the pattern, the effectiveness of these tiny strikes, the precision, the impact. And soon, India made a fateful decision: to join the storm. Wind intensifies. From Bombay to Visakhapatnam, the Indian Navy began preparing for the unthinkable: Operation Jackpot, a coordinated sea offensive that would merge the Mukti Bahini with Indian naval might. But before that day could come, betrayal struck. In a coastal camp near the Sundarbans, one of the Mukti Bahini trainees vanished. Days later, Pakistani forces raided the exact location. Dozens were killed. The camp was burned to the ground. Someone had talked. And suddenly the fragile trust that bound the fighters began to crack. Rain pattering on metal roofs. Radio static builds distant thunder. By mid-1971, the world had begun to whisper about a rebellion taking shape on the eastern edge of Pakistan. Newspapers called it a civil war. Diplomats called it a crisis. But to the men of the Mukti Bahini, it was a war for breath. A war to exist. And now, the war was coming to the sea. Low heartbeat sounds. The plan had a name whispered like a code: Operation Jackpot. It wasn't just one operation. It was a movement in 4 acts. A campaign that would paralyze the ports of East Pakistan, destroy its supply lines, and prove that even without a navy, the Bengalis could own the waters. But it wasn't born in some war room. It began in silence, in a makeshift camp in Plassey near the Indian border. There, under the watch of Indian Navy officers, hundreds of young Bengalis trained in secret. They learned to swim long distances with explosives tied to their chests, to approach ships underwater without a ripple, and to strike where no radar could detect them. The Indian instructors called them frogmen. The Mukti Bahini called them Jal Bahini, the water force. Each man was given a mission, a name, and a death wish, because they knew, once they entered enemy waters, there would be no rescue. Soft splash of water. Their targets were chosen carefully: Chittagong, Mongla, Chandpur, and Narayanganj, 4 ports that kept Pakistan alive. If they fell, the entire eastern wing would suffocate. The night of August 15, 1971 was chosen, India's Independence Day. A symbolic message. As one nation celebrated freedom, another would begin to fight for its own. Clock ticking slowly. As darkness fell, small boats slipped out of hidden coves. Each carried men trained to disappear into the tide, their bodies painted black, their hearts pounding louder than the waves. In their waterproof packs lay small cylindrical bombs, each just large enough to cripple a ship if placed perfectly against its hull. The moon vanished. The river was ink. They swam, silent and unseen. Heartbeat quickens. At Chittagong, the first group reached the docks past midnight. Cargo ships of the Pakistan Navy lay anchored, proud, gleaming, full of supplies and weapons meant for the army fighting inland. A single mistake could mean instant death. The harbor was crawling with patrols. But the Mukti Bahini divers moved like ghosts. They attached limpet mines beneath the ships one after another, and then vanished back into the dark. Clock ticks to 2 a.m. The first explosion tore through the silence, then another, then another. Within minutes, the Chittagong harbor was on fire. Ships burned. Oil slicks spread like black veins across the water. The sky glowed red. Waves roaring, chaos, shouting in Urdu and Bengali. By dawn, 11 ships were destroyed. The port, the artery of Pakistan's eastern supply line, was crippled. In the days that followed, explosions echoed across Mongla, Chandpur, and Narayanganj. The entire network of river transport, the lifeline that fed Pakistan's troops, began to collapse. Coal, oil, and ammunition shipments vanished. The Pakistani army suddenly found itself isolated, its soldiers starving, its tanks dry, its command blind. The Mukti Bahini had done the impossible. They had turned the sea into their weapon. Wind howls, rain stops. But while the ports burned, far away in Rawalpindi, panic spread through the naval headquarters. How could untrained guerrillas cripple the might of the Pakistan Navy? Was India behind it? Or worse, were Bengali officers inside the Navy betraying their own command? Low murmurs, papers rustling. An order went out. Find the traitors, crush the network, make an example. And in the ports that survived, the Pakistani military began executing suspected saboteurs. Young dock workers were hanged, fishermen disappeared, entire villages near the riverbanks were burned. Yet the raids continued. Every week, somewhere along the delta, another explosion, another ship sunk, another convoy lost. The fear was spreading faster than the fire. By September, the Mukti Bahini had achieved something no one thought possible. They had forced Pakistan's navy to retreat into deeper waters far from the coast. Its ships no longer dared to approach the rivers or ports. The very symbol of Pakistan's control, its sea power, was fading. But with every victory came a cost. The young divers, the frogmen, were dying faster than they could be replaced. Of the hundreds who trained, dozens never returned. Some were captured, tortured, and dumped into the rivers they once fought from. One of them, a man named Bashar, only 22, was found floating near the Karnafuli River. His body was mangled, his face unrecognizable. In his clenched fist, still bound by rope, was the detonator. He never let it go. Silence. The people began to call them the warriors of the deep, not soldiers, not rebels, but spirits of the delta, men who became the tide. Soft music rises. The Indian Navy, impressed by their bravery, decided it was time to expand the partnership. The Mukti Bahini would no longer just sabotage, they would fight alongside Indian commandos in full-scale naval operations. Plans were drawn for something larger, bolder, something that would not just hurt Pakistan's fleet but destroy it completely. And this time, it wouldn't be a secret. It would be war, air sirens faint in distance. But as the Indian and Mukti Bahini forces prepared, a new challenge loomed. Pakistan had begun receiving intelligence from foreign allies. American reconnaissance planes were watching the Bay of Bengal. The Seventh Fleet was moving closer. And suddenly, the war for liberation was entangled in the web of superpowers. The small nation fighting for its breath was now standing on a chessboard where giants moved their pieces. Low thunder rolling, waves crashing harder. The question was no longer, can Mukti Bahini choke Pakistan's sea lines, but can they survive the coming storm of nations? Wind roars, silence drops suddenly. Low hum of wind through broken hulls, distant seagulls crying over blackened water. The Bay of Bengal had changed. Where once merchant ships glided under the green flag of Pakistan, now there was wreckage, burnt steel, drifting debris, the smell of oil and death. The Mukti Bahini had struck again and again until fear replaced command and silence replaced arrogance. But power never admits defeat. In Islamabad, the generals told the nation everything was under control, that the traitors would be crushed, that East Pakistan was loyal. Yet inside their war rooms, panic had a new face. The map of the sea was bleeding red with lost routes, sound of pencil tapping on a table. Each red mark was a sunken ship, a missing convoy, a dead promise. The sea lines were collapsing, and with them Pakistan's hold on its eastern half. Still, the world remained quiet. The West called it an internal conflict. The United Nations spoke of political solutions. No one dared to see the truth, that a nation was being starved to death in plain sight. In the refugee camps of India, the air was thick with hopelessness. 10 million Bengalis lived in mud and misery. Women clutching photos of vanished husbands, children staring blankly at empty rice bowls. But amid this despair, something else grew. Resolve. In the far corners of the camps, Indian intelligence officers met secretly with Mukti Bahini leaders. Maps were drawn on the dirt. Names of Pakistani officers were whispered. The plan was evolving, from guerrilla strikes to open warfare. The Indian Navy's Eastern Command, led by Vice Admiral N. Krishnan, saw an opportunity. He realized something few others did, that the Mukti Bahini and small victories at sea weren't just symbolic. They were strategic proof that Pakistan's navy could be cornered. All it needed now was a push, waves hitting wooden hulls. So India began to prepare, quietly but swiftly. Ships were moved eastward, submarines repositioned, and Mukti Bahini operatives were given access to more weapons, better boats, and Indian communication systems. But time was running out. Pakistan's Western Command, desperate to stop the bleeding, began retaliating brutally in East Pakistan. Villages near the rivers were destroyed. Anyone suspected of aiding the Mukti Bahini was shot without trial. They called it counterinsurgency, but history remembers it as genocide. Silence, faint crying in the background. The rivers ran red again, yet the sea, that same sea that had swallowed Pakistani ships, remained defiant. And the Mukti Bahini, though broken and hunted, refused to stop. By October 1971, the world's newspapers began printing satellite images. Oil slicks near Chittagong, charred docks, ghost ports. Journalists whispered of mystery saboteurs crippling Pakistan's economy. But few knew it was a band of young men with no flag, no ships, only courage. Typing sounds, cameras clicking. One of them, Lieutenant Commander M.N. Samant, an Indian officer working secretly with Mukti Bahini, kept a diary. He wrote, "They have nothing but fire in their hearts. These boys are ready to die to drown an empire." The plan for the next phase was audacious. Use the Mukti Bahini to prepare the ground while the Indian Navy struck simultaneously once war was declared. They would trap the Pakistan Navy in a pincer, from land, river, and sea. But before that could happen, the storm of politics struck harder than any missile. Radio static fades in. American news voice. The U.S. government today reaffirmed its support for Pakistan, citing the need for regional stability. Static fades. Washington had made its choice. Pakistan was its Cold War ally. India's growing ties with the Soviet Union had drawn clear lines in the sand. And as the death toll in East Pakistan crossed 500,000, the great powers looked away. Ships of the U.S. 7th Fleet were spotted near the Strait of Malacca, a silent warning to India. For a moment, it seemed the dream of liberation would drown in the geopolitics of giants. But then came Indira Gandhi. The Indian Prime Minister made a decision that would change history. She would no longer wait for world sympathy. She would act. Slow build of drums. Indian troops began quietly massing along the border. Mukti Bahini units received new supplies, radios, rifles, speedboats. The Indian Navy finalized war plans. The clock was ticking. Pakistan didn't know it yet, but its days were numbered. Yet the sea, always the first to sense coming storms, began to whisper again. Pakistani naval convoys, frightened by the sabotage, now hugged the coast of Burma, avoiding open waters. They stopped trusting local sailors. They started using foreign-flagged ships to transport supplies under secrecy. But even those weren't safe. On November 8th, a disguised Mukti Bahini team intercepted one such convoy near the Sundarbans. They used old riverboats hiding beneath nets of reeds waiting for the night tide. When the convoy entered the narrow channel, they struck, fast and silent. Within minutes, flames rose high enough to light the mangroves. Another blow to Pakistan's supply line, and another message carved into the dark. The sea belongs to those who fight for it. Fire crackling, distant shouting fades out. But victory has a strange cost. It draws attention. Pakistan's high command was enraged. They suspected India was orchestrating everything, and they were right. To retaliate, they began preparing Operation Chengiz Khan, a full-scale strike to cripple India before it could enter the war. And as jets roared westward, the sky over East Pakistan filled with smoke and fear. The inevitable had begun. Wind roaring over open sea, distant engines rumbling, the slow metallic creak of warships cutting through waves. December 1971. The Bay of Bengal, once a silent witness to centuries of trade and tide, now prepared to bear witness to war. The skies were gray, the waves restless. And somewhere on that vast expanse of water, history was waiting to explode. Pakistan's navy had been pushed to its limit, its supply routes in the east, strangled by Mukti Bahini raids, its ports, half crippled, haunted by wreckage, its confidence shattered, and yet it still clung to the illusion of command. In Chittagong and Khulna, small Pakistani vessels, gunboats and patrol ships, tried to guard what was left of their domain. But what they didn't know was that both the Indian Navy and the Mukti Bahini had already drawn their battle lines. The war had officially begun, and the Bay of Bengal was about to burn. Low, slow drumbeat begins. In Visakhapatnam, the Eastern Naval Command under Vice Admiral N. Krishnan had already set its plans into motion, codenamed Operation Trident and Operation Python in the west, and Operation Jackpot in the east. These missions would deliver the final blow to Pakistan's naval strength. But the east was different. It wasn't a straightforward sea battle. It was a labyrinth of rivers, deltas, and mangroves, a world where the Mukti Bahini ruled, and where India needed their eyes, their knowledge, and their courage. The Indian Navy's missile boats and frigates began moving toward the eastern coast. Their mission? Blockade every route that connected East Pakistan to the outside world. Nothing would go in or out. Food, fuel, ammunition, all of it would be cut off. The sea itself would become a prison, thunder rolling across open water. At the same time, the Mukti Bahini launched its most ambitious assault yet, codenamed Operation Hot Pants, the continuation of Jackpot. Using speedboats fitted with machine guns and small rocket launchers supplied by India, they began attacking river transports carrying Pakistani troops. In the fog-laden mornings, gunfire echoed across the Padma and Meghna rivers. Fishermen watched as flames rose from barges that once carried soldiers. The rivers turned from routes of control to veins of chaos, sounds of gunfire, shouting, splashing. The Pakistani Navy tried to retaliate, sending out its gunboats, but most were outdated and overextended. They couldn't fight a war on both land and water, not against an enemy that moved like smoke. And soon the news tightened further. The Indian Navy announced the blockade. Every port, every inlet, every river mouth was sealed. In Dhaka, panic began to grow. The army could no longer be supplied. Oil reserves dwindled. Ammunition was rationed. Even the communication cables were being cut. The war had entered its final act, and Pakistan was gasping for air. Low wind, faint echo of radio chatter. On the night of December 9th, Indian Navy intelligence picked up signals that Pakistan's largest ship in the east, the PNS Jasore, was anchored near Khulna. It was one of the last major naval assets Pakistan still had in East Pakistan. If it could be destroyed, the sea war would effectively end. So the Mukti Bahini took the lead. A team of frogmen, many of whom had trained under Indian command months earlier, volunteered for what they knew would likely be their final mission. Under a moonless sky, they moved silently through the mangrove channels in small boats. The air was heavy, humid, filled with the smell of salt and death. When they reached the anchorage, they slipped into the water, unseen. Each man carried a limpet mine strapped to his chest, water bubbling softly, breath echoing under mask. They reached the hull, attached the explosives, swam back, vanishing into the darkness of the Sundarbans. At 3:12 a.m., the night cracked open. An explosion split the sky, followed by another and another. The PNS Jasore went up in flames, its metal belly ripped open. The sound rolled across the coast like thunder. Waves crashing violently, alarms blaring, shouting. When dawn broke, all that remained of Pakistan's naval power in the east was smoke and debris drifting across the gray horizon. The Mukti Bahini had done it again. They had ended a navy. But the victory was more than just military. It was symbolic. For years, Pakistan had ruled East Bengal with the belief that control of the sea meant control of the land. Now that illusion was gone. And for the first time, East Pakistan was truly isolated. Silence, then slow music rises. As the blockade tightened, Indian aircraft began bombing supply depots and communication centers. Mukti Bahini ground forces, coordinated with the Indian Army, pushed rapidly toward Dhaka. The once invincible Pakistan Army was surrounded, land, air, and sea. In Rawalpindi, the generals refused to believe what the reports said. They accused each other of betrayal. But the truth was simpler. The empire was collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance. Soft wind through the mangroves, seagulls crying over a quiet bay, the slow rhythm of water against abandoned docks. The war had ended. The guns were silent. The red and green flag of a newborn nation fluttered over Dhaka. But the sea, the same sea that had burned, screamed, and bled, was now eerily calm. It was over. Or so the world believed. Waves lapping gently, distant echo of an old radio tune fading. For Bangladesh, independence had come, but at a cost no one could count. 3 million lives lost, hundreds of villages erased from maps, and thousands of men and women whose names would never be written in history books. Among them, the nameless heroes of the sea, the Mukti Bahini's Jal Bahini, the frogmen, the smugglers, the saboteurs, men who turned fishing nets into weapons and boats into bombs. Their stories were whispered, then forgotten, because after the victory, the world moved on, to politics, to power, to rebuilding. But the waves, they remembered. Silence, then a single raindrop hitting metal. The Indian Navy withdrew its ships in January 1972. The blockade lifted. And for the first time in years, trade ships began to re-enter the Bay of Bengal under a new flag. Bangladesh was free, but broken. Its ports were in ruins. Chittagong, the lifeline of the nation, was a graveyard of rusted hulls. Oil still floated in the water like a black mirror reflecting the sky. And yet, amid that devastation, there was pride. Because every wreck was proof that freedom had been earned, not given. Low hum of wind against empty cranes. The survivors of the Mukti Bahini returned home, many to find their homes gone, their families scattered, their comrades buried under river mud. But when asked if it was worth it, they said only one thing. We sank their ships. We cut their breath. That is enough. The sea had been their battlefield. Now it became their silence. Far away in Karachi, a different silence lingered. The silence of defeat. The Pakistan Navy, once proud, now carried the shame of loss. For the first time since its creation, it had been crippled by men without uniforms. And in the corridors of power, blame replaced reflection. Some said the Americans could have saved them. Others said India had cheated. But no one dared admit the truth, that arrogance had blinded them, that a nation that ignored its own people was destroyed not by enemies, but by its own cruelty. Sound of papers rustling, faint echo of typewriter keys. In classified reports, Pakistan called it a naval setback, but the Mukti Bahini called it what it truly was, revenge of the river people. For centuries, the Bengalis had lived by water. They fished in it, prayed by it, died in it. And in 1971, they used it to win back their dignity. The rivers, once used to transport oppression, became roots of rebellion. The sea, once controlled by an empire, became the voice of a nation. Soft sitar music begins, distant waves rolling in. Years later, when historians would write about the war, they would speak of generals and battles, of Dhaka, of Indira Gandhi, of surrender. But few would speak of the nights when young men swam beneath the surface unseen, carrying death in their hands and hope in their hearts. Few would speak of the sound of waves crashing against steel hulls moments before explosions, or the silence that followed when the water swallowed everything, the ships, the soldiers, the names. These were not wars of glory. They were wars of necessity. Wars fought not to conquer land but to reclaim identity. Gentle rain begins to fall, and in that rain one can still hear their whispers, of rivers turned red, of freedom bought with salt and blood. By the mid-1970s, the world had already begun to forget. The Cold War marched on. Superpowers changed alliances. But Bangladesh remained, small, proud, scarred, standing between rivers and sea. Its navy, rebuilt from the fragments of Mukti Bahini's boats, carried forward a legacy no other force in the world could claim, that it was born not in peace, but in defiance. Every time a Bangladeshi ship sails through the Bay of Bengal today, it sails through the ghosts of 1971, through the wrecks of enemy vessels, through the stories buried in salt water. The sea still remembers. It always does. Silence. Soft piano fades in, tone turns reflective. History often hides behind the word strategy. But the truth of this war was not written in military plans. It was written in human will, in the trembling hands of a young diver holding a detonator, in the cries of fishermen who refused to betray their land, in the quiet courage of a nation that fought back when the world looked away. Because the illusion of power, no matter how vast, always breaks before the truth of purpose. And that truth was this: no army, no navy, no empire can rule forever over those who have learned to fight in silence. Waves calm, birds return, faint light breaking through clouds. The Bay of Bengal is peaceful now, but if you stand at the edge of the water at dawn, when the tide is low and the wind carries memory, you can almost hear them, the whispers of the Mukti Bahini, the spirits of the deep. Their message drifts with every wave. Freedom always comes at a price. But once it arrives, no power on earth can sink it again. Long pause, sea breeze fades. Soft piano note holds, then fades into silence.